to the trenchers of this world. Between centuries of suffering and torment, many stories can be told, of good and evil, faith and heresy, naive longing and forbidden desire. In another age, the veneer of civilization would have been thicker and the boundaries between categories more blurred. But this is not the age of the Trench Crusade. Here, moderation and coexistence are as thin as molecules, and great devotion is contrasted by utter hate. They are, after all, the same. The predator devours the prey. It cannot help itself. The angel cannot shed its light without burning the eyes of the innocent. So let us listen to their stories. Lives and no life spent unnoticed, not only surviving but living and existing, if only for a moment. Let us listen to the voices of the trench. The echo in the ashes. In the grinding stalemate of the Trench Crusade, where faith and damnation clash in endless trench warfare, a single discovery can unravel the fragile loyalties that bind men to their cause. When a heretic captain seizes what appears to be a decisive victory against the church, he ignites a chain of events that pits him against a ruthless rival from within his own ranks. Trapped in a ruined monastery and surrounded by enemies both living and undead, he is forced to confront the true cost of his rebellion and the bitter irony that the greatest threats often come not from the enemy at the gate, but from the lies we tell ourselves. Chapter 1. The Fallen Star. The mud had a voice. It was a low, guttural sound, a constant sucking and squelching that spoke of things drowned and forgotten. It was the voice of no man's land, and Captain Iskar knew its every inflection. Tonight it was restless. Rain fell in a cold, insistent drizzle, turning the floor of the trench into a viscous slurry that clung to his boots with every step. The air, thick with the stench of cordite, rot, and something else, something faintly sweet and metallic, like old blood and ozone, stung the nostrils. Iskar paused, leaning against a shattered timber prop, his gaze scanning the skeletal remains of a forest that stood like a row of broken teeth against the horizon. The war had gnawed at this land for so long, it felt less like a place and more like a wound. He could feel the eyes of his warband on him, a dozen men huddled in the dugout's meager shelter. They were heretics, all of them, men who had turned their backs on the church and the God that had forsaken them. Iskar was no different. He remembered the debt collectors from the Bank of Mammon, their faces as cold and polished as the coins they demanded. He remembered the empty house after they'd taken his family to settle an account that could never be settled. That was the day he had traded the crisp uniform of a church soldier for the ragged, mud-caked gear of a rebel. He fought not for a cause, but for the simple, burning need to make the other side suffer as he had suffered. Captain. The voice was a dry rasp belonging to Sergeant Rowan. The veteran emerged from the shadows, his face a roadmap of old scars and newer hardships. He held out a dented canteen. Nothing on the wire, just the ghosts singing their usual hymns. Iskar took the canteen, the water inside tasting faintly of rust. The ghosts are the least of our problems, Rowan. It's the quiet I don't trust. He handed it back. Vashka's scouts were spotted near the old mill yesterday. She's probing, looking for weakness. Rowan spat a glob of black phlegm into the mud. Overseer Vashka can probe all she likes. We've got nothing she wants. We have this trench, Iskar said, a grim smile touching his lips, and she's always wanted this trench. A sudden sharp crack echoed from the darkness, followed by a sound unlike any artillery shell. It was a long, tearing groan, like fabric ripping across the sky. Iskar and Rowan flinched, pressing themselves against the trench wall, but there was no explosion. Instead, a faint, desperate whistling descended, ending in a wet, crashing thud somewhere out in the barbed wire. "What in the nine hells was that?" one of the younger heretics, Thomas, whispered, his voice trembling. "Not a shell," Rowan grunted, peering over the parapet. "Too slow, too flimsy." Iskar was already moving. "Thomas, Lycos with me? Rowan, cover us. The rest of you, stay sharp." He slung his rifle and drew a long, heavy-bladed trench knife. The three men clambered over the top, sinking immediately to their knees in the churned earth. The darkness was absolute, broken only by distant star shells that cast fleeting, ghastly light over the landscape. They moved in a low crouch, following the path of destruction, a fresh scar of torn earth and snapped wire. There, tangled in a web of steel thorns, was the source of the noise. It was a Papal Air Force reconnaissance balloon, or what was left of it. The envelope was a shredded ruin of silk and varnish, deflating like a dying lung. The wicker basket had shattered on impact, its contents spilling into the mud. And amidst the wreckage, a figure stirred. It was a man, clad in the dark blue-gray of a church observer. A brother of the Synod of Strategic Prophecy, judging by the intricate, if now mud-smeared insignia on his tunic. He was pinned by a spar of the basket, one leg bent at a sickening angle. Blood seeped from a gash on his forehead, washing pale in the faint light. In his hands, he clutched a leather satchel to his chest as if it were his own child. "A papal crow," Lycos hissed, raising his rifle. "Let's finish him and be done with it." "Hold," Iskar commanded, his voice low but leaving no room for argument. He approached cautiously. The churchman's eyes were open, wide with pain and fear, but a defiant light still burned within them. His lips moved silently, forming the shapes of prayers. Iskar knelt, ignoring the mud soaking through his trousers. He pried the satchel from the man's grasp. The observer, Brother Luca, according to the name stitched on his uniform, offered no resistance, his strength clearly fading. Iskar opened the satchel. Inside, protected by an oilskin wrap, were several sheets of paper covered in dense, coded script and annotated maps. Supply routes, depots, timetables for convoys heading to the besieged fortress city of New Antioch. This was more than a lucky find. This was a potential turning point. Information like this, delivered to the right heretic commander, could strangle the church's lifeline. It could win a battle, maybe even a war. "He's not long for this world," Lycos observed, nudging the broken leg with his boot. The observer gasped, his prayers becoming a ragged moan. "Then we'll make his remaining time useful," Iskar said, tucking the documents inside his own coat. "We're taking him back. Rowan, we've got a prisoner." As Rowan and another man scrambled over to help, they dragged Brother Luca from the wreckage. He cried out as his legs shifted, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness of no man's land. They fashioned a crude stretcher from a splintered panel of the basket and a couple of rifles, and began the slow, treacherous journey back to their lines. They had not gone more than 50 yards when the mud began to move. Not the slow sink of a footstep, but a churning, as if the earth itself were boiling. Pale, skeletal hands clawed their way to the surface, followed by figures caked in the filth of the grave. Their uniforms were a patchwork of decay, their eyes vacant sockets glowing with a faint, malevolent light. Trench ghosts, the eternal sentinels of this damned ground, risen from their shallow graves to defend their territory from any who dared trespass. "Ghosts!" Tomas screamed, his voice cracking with panic. The air filled with the dry rattle of rifle bolts and the guttural clicks of the undead. A shot rang out from the heretic line, and one of the ghosts staggered, a chunk of its chest dissolving into mist. It did not fall. It merely turned its head, the glowing eyes fixing on the shooter, and began to shamble forward with renewed purpose. "Don't stop moving," Rowan bellowed, firing his pistol into the advancing horde. "Back to the trench, now!" The retreat became a frantic, stumbling fight. Iskar fired his rifle, the bark of the gun deafeningly loud. A ghost, its face a leering skull with scraps of flesh still clinging to the bone, lunged at the stretcher. Iskar met it with his trench knife, driving the blade up under its chin. The thing thrashed, a dry hiss escaping its lipless mouth, before crumbling into a pile of rot and rusted buckles. Lycos was not so lucky. 2 ghosts swarmed him, dragging him down into the mud. His screams were cut short as the mire closed over him. Another man, a quiet heretic named Silas, fell to a bayonet thrust from a ghost that still carried its ancient weapon. They were being picked apart. "Leave the prisoner," Tomas begged, his face a mask of terror. "We have to run." Iskar ignored him, helping Rowan haul the stretcher through the clinging mud. He fired again and again, the ghosts seeming to multiply in the darkness. Finally, with a final desperate surge, they tumbled over the parapet and back into the relative safety of their trench. The remaining men slammed a reinforced cover over the opening, and the sounds of scratching and moaning from the other side slowly faded as the ghosts lost interest and returned to their eternal patrols. Iskar leaned against the trench wall, his chest heaving. They had lost 2 good men for a dying churchman and a handful of papers. He looked at Brother Luca, who had been laid unceremoniously on the duckboards. The man's eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow and rapid. Fever was setting in. "Get him to the monastery," Iskar ordered, his voice hoarse. "The old dugout in the crypt, keep him alive." Rowan wiped blood from a cut on his cheek. "For what, Captain? So he can die on a dry bed instead of a wet field? He's a liability. Vashka will hear we have a prisoner." "Let her hear," Iskar said, his fingers brushing against the documents hidden in his coat. He could feel the weight of them, the potential they held. This is more important than Vashka's ambition. This is about survival, our survival. He looked at the faces of his remaining men, exhausted, frightened, but loyal. "Rowan, I need you to keep him breathing, just long enough." Rowan's cynical eyes met his, and for a moment, Iskar saw not doubt, but a grim understanding. The sergeant nodded slowly. "As you command, Captain, but if he starts singing their hymns, I'm cutting his throat myself. The men are spooked enough as it is." As Rowan organized the move to their fortified position in the shell of a nearby monastery, Iskar remained in the trench. He looked out at the darkness, towards the church lines. He thought of the debt collectors, of his family, of the endless grinding war. This intelligence was a weapon. But like any weapon, it was dangerous to the one who held it if he did not know how to wield it. He had to be careful. He had to be smart. For the first time in a long time, Captain Iskar felt a flicker of something other than hatred. He felt hope, and he knew, with a cold certainty, that hope was the most dangerous feeling of all. Chapter 2: The Rival. The ruined monastery offered a sanctuary as fragile as a bird's egg. Its vaulted stone ceilings were open to the sky, and the stained glass windows were mere skeletal frames. But the crypt beneath remained intact, a low, damp space smelling of wet stone and old bones. It was here they had laid Brother Luca on a makeshift cot, his feverish murmurs echoing off the walls. The sounds were prayers, snatches of scripture spoken in a delirium that seemed to infect the very air. Iskar stood at the top of the crypt steps, looking out through a gap in the monastery's shattered wall. Dawn was breaking, a sullen gray light creeping over the desolation. He could see the distant, hulking silhouette of Overseer Vashka's bunker complex, a scar of concrete and steel on the horizon. It was a fortress compared to their own crumbling refuge. News traveled fast in the trenches, carried on whispers in the wind. It would not be long. Sergeant Rowan climbed the steps to join him, his face grim. "The churchman's babbling is getting to the men. They think his faith is a curse, that it'll bring a plague down on us." "Superstition," Iskar said, though he too felt a chill at the relentless whispered prayers. "He's a dying man. His God has abandoned him here, same as ours abandoned us." "Try telling them that," Rowan grunted, nodding towards the handful of heretics huddled around a small, smokeless fire. They cast nervous glances towards the crypt entrance. They see a man clinging to his faith even as he rots, and it makes them question their own choices, especially young Thomas. He's been hovering near the crypt all night. Iskar's gaze sharpened. Thomas was the youngest of them, a boy conscripted into the Heretic legions more out of desperation than conviction. He was easily swayed. "Keep an eye on him. We can't afford doubt. Not now." His hand went to the inside pocket of his coat, where the documents lay folded. He had spent most of the night studying them by the light of a guttering candle. The coded script was complex, a mix of church cipher and tactical shorthand, but the maps were clear. They detailed supply routes snaking from the southern ports towards New Antioch. If authentic, this intelligence was a key that could unlock the entire front. But its value made it a target. As if summoned by his thought, a sentry's whistle cut through the morning air. 2 short, sharp blasts. A visitor. Iskar and Rowan exchanged a look. They descended to the main hall of the monastery, where the remaining members of the warband were already taking up defensive positions behind broken pillars and piled rubble. A single figure approached from no man's land, moving with an unnerving grace over the broken ground. He wore the black, form-fitting armor of a death commando, but his helmet was tucked under his arm, revealing a sharp, handsome face with a sardonic smile. It was Kale, Overseer Vashka's emissary. He moved as if the mud and wire were mere inconveniences, his polished boots barely seeming to touch the ground. "Captain Iskar," Kale called out, his voice smooth and carrying. He stopped a dozen paces from the monastery entrance, his hands open and empty. "I come under a flag of truce. Overseer Vashka sends her compliments." "Does she now?" Iskar stepped forward, Rowan a half pace behind him. "And what does the Overseer want with a minor warband holed up in a ruin?" Kale's smile widened. "Let's not play the fool, Captain. We know what fell into your lap last night. A papal balloon, an observer, documents." He gestured vaguely towards the crypt. "Overseer Vashka believes such a prize is too significant to remain in the hands of a localized command. She offers to relieve you of this burden, for the good of the entire heretic cause, of course." "Of course," Iskar said, his voice flat. "And what does she offer in return for this relief?" "Her gratitude," Kale said, as if it were the most valuable currency in the world. "And the assurance that your warband will be remembered when promotions are considered. You'll be noted as having made a valuable contribution." Iskar felt a cold anger stir in his gut. He remembered the last time Vashka had offered her gratitude. It was after the skirmish at the redoubt, when his men had bled to hold a position she had ordered abandoned. She had taken the credit for the tactical withdrawal and the preservation of forces, while Iskar buried his dead. Her gratitude was as worthless as church indulgences. "Tell Overseer Vashka," Iskar said, keeping his voice level, "that my warband captured the intelligence, and my warband will decide its disposition. We risked our lives for it. We'll decide its price." Kale's smile didn't falter, but his eyes grew colder. "A short-sighted view, Captain. This is not a matter of personal gain. This intelligence could shift the balance of the siege. Hoarding it out of pride is counterproductive. Some might even call it treasonous." The word hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Rowan shifted his weight, his hand drifting towards the pistol on his hip. The other heretics tensed, their grips tightening on their weapons. "Treason?" Iskar took a step forward, his own anger breaking through his restraint. Where was Vashka's concern for the heretic cause when she withheld artillery support at the mill crossroads? Where was her gratitude when she left my flank exposed to save her own precious command? She hoards resources like a dragon hoards gold, sacrificing lesser warbands to preserve her own power. "Don't speak to me of treason, Kale. Her ambition is a greater threat to our cause than any church paladin." The silence that followed was brittle. Kale studied Iskar, the sardonic mask slipping for a moment to reveal a calculating intelligence. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod as if confirming something. "I will convey your sentiments to the Overseer," Kale said softly. He replaced his helmet, the polished black surface reflecting the ruined monastery. "But know this, Captain Iskar. The Overseer does not like to be refused, and she does not like to wait." With that, he turned and walked back across no man's land, as calmly as if he were taking a stroll through a park. They watched him until he was a small dark speck against the mud, then disappeared into the labyrinth of trenches leading to Vashka's domain. Rowan let out a long breath. "Well, that's done it. You've poked the hornet's nest with a sharp stick." "She was always going to come," Iskar said, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "This just means she'll come faster." He turned and walked back into the monastery, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Rowan was right. Their warband was small, poorly equipped. A direct assault from Vashka's forces would crush them. Holding on to the documents was a gamble with their lives as the stake. He descended into the crypt. The air was thicker down here, colder. Brother Luca lay on the cot, his skin pale and slick with sweat. His muttering had subsided into a low, continuous stream of prayer. One of the men, a hulking heretic named Gregor, was standing guard, his face a mixture of disgust and unease. "He keeps talking about angels and redemption," Gregor muttered. "It's bad for morale, Captain." "Leave us," Iskar said. When Gregor had clomped up the stone steps, Iskar stood over the dying man. He watched the rise and fall of his chest, the flicker of his eyelids. This man, in his unwavering faith, had become the center of a storm. Iskar's pride and resentment towards Vashka had locked them in a confrontation they could not win. Was he truly holding on to the intelligence for strategic reasons? Or was it simply because he refused to be bullied by the woman who had betrayed him before? The thought was an uncomfortable one. He had built his new identity on the ashes of the old, a heretic captain defined by his hatred of the church. But now, facing a threat from within his own ranks, he wondered if he was any better than the corrupt institution he fought. Was he leading his men to their deaths for a principle or for his own bruised ego? A soft sound made him turn. Tomas was standing at the entrance to the crypt, his young face pale in the gloom. He was staring at Brother Luca with a strange intensity, not of hatred, but of longing. "Captain." Tomas began, then faltered. "What is it, Tomas?" The young heretic swallowed hard. "Nothing, Captain, just checking on the prisoner." But Iskar saw the look in his eyes. It was the look of a lost soul seeing a distant light, a light he feared was forever extinguished for him. Tomas quickly turned and hurried away, but the image stayed with Iskar. The siege was not just physical anymore. It was seeping into their minds, testing their resolve, cracking the foundations of their rebellion. He looked from the feverish churchman to the stone steps leading up to his anxious men and then towards the distant bunker where Vashka was plotting her move. The dilemma was tightening around him like a noose. Surrender the documents and be left with nothing, fight and be destroyed, or hold on and hope for a miracle that felt less likely with every passing hour. The fallen star had not brought hope. It had brought a curse. Chapter 3: The Dilemma. The air in the crypt had grown thick with the scent of sickness and damp stone. Brother Luca's fever had worsened, his prayers becoming a tangled web of scripture and delirium. Iskar stood over him, a cup of water in his hand. The time for subtlety was past. He needed answers, and the coded documents, for all their apparent detail, were a locked box. The key lay with the dying man. "Brother Luca," Iskar said, his voice echoing softly in the vaulted space. "Can you hear me?" The churchman's eyes fluttered open. They were glassy with fever, but a core of clarity remained, a stubborn ember of faith. He focused on Iskar's face, on the heretic insignia stitched onto his coat. A faint, contemptuous smile touched his cracked lips. "The serpent comes to tempt," Luca whispered, his voice a dry rustle. "But my soul is the Lord's." "I'm not here for your soul," Iskar said, kneeling beside the cot. He offered the water. Luca turned his head away. "I'm here for the truth. These roots," Iskar tapped the documents now lying on a nearby crate. "Are they current? Are they real? Or is this a trap laid by your synod?" Luca closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. Iskar felt a surge of frustration. This resolute silence, this unshakable faith, was a weapon in itself. It was a wall he could not breach. "I was once like you," Iskar said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. He had not planned to say this, to reveal this part of himself. But the wall demanded a battering ram. "I wore the blue-gray. I served the church. I believed." Luca's eyes opened again, a flicker of interest breaking through the pious disdain. "Then you have fallen far, Captain, and you will fall further into the pit." "I fell because the church I served sold my family's future to the bank of mammon over a debt that could never be repaid," Iskar snapped, the old anger heating his blood. "They took everything. My faith died that day, not in a grand heresy, but in a ledger book. I fight for the heretics because your church left me no other choice." He expected shock, perhaps a glimmer of sympathy. Instead, Luca's gaze remained steady, almost pitying. "The mission of the church is greater than any one man's suffering. The war against hell is the only war that matters. Your personal tragedy is a leaf in a storm. By turning from God's light, you have damned yourself. You side with the adversary." The words were like a physical blow. There was no recognition of his pain, no acknowledgement of the injustice, just cold dogmatic certainty. Iskar's frustration boiled over. He grabbed the front of Luca's tunic, not violently, but with an intensity that made the churchman gasp. "Damn your mission," Iskar hissed. "Men are dying out there, my men, for what? For a lie? For your God's pride? Tell me what these documents mean." Their confrontation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the stone stairs. Rowan appeared, his face grim. "Scouts report movement from Vashka's compound. Her forces are mobilizing. They're spreading out, surrounding the monastery. They've cut the eastern trench line, our only clear escape route." Iskar released Luca, his mind racing. It was happening faster than he'd anticipated. Vashka wasn't just threatening, she was acting. He climbed the steps to the main hall, Rowan at his heels. Through a gap in the wall, he could see distant figures moving along the trench lines like ants sealing a hive. They were trapped. Back in the relative privacy of the crypt entrance, Iskar faced his sergeant. Options? Rowan spat on the floor. We have none. We can't fight her. She has artillery, choristers. We're outnumbered 5-1. We can't run. She's sealed the ways out. We could surrender the documents, Iskar said, the words tasting like ash. Hand over Luca. Hope she grants us mercy. Rowan barked a harsh laugh. Mercy? From Vashka? She'll take what she wants, then have us shot as traitors for resisting in the first place. No, surrender is a death sentence. Then we hold out, Iskar said, though the idea felt futile. We fortify what we can. Hope for a distraction, maybe a church assault that pulls her away. Hope is not a strategy, Rowan said, his voice low and serious. There is a fourth option. He glanced towards the crypt. We burn the documents. We kill the prisoner. We deny her the prize. Then we negotiate. We tell her the intelligence was lost in the fighting with the trench ghosts, that the churchman died of his wounds. We come to her with nothing but our empty hands. It's the only move that might save the warband. Iskar stared at him. Destroy the very thing they had fought and died for? Erase the potential advantage, the flicker of hope? It was the pragmatic choice, the safe choice, but it felt like an admission of total defeat. It meant Vashka won without firing a shot. It meant Lycos and Silas had died for nothing. I need to think, Iskar said, turning away. The dilemma was a cage. Every door led to ruin. Surrender and be executed. Fight and be slaughtered. Destroy the intelligence and live as beggars in Vashka's shadow if she even let them live. He was the captain. The decision was his, and it would weigh the lives of every man under his command. He walked through the monastery past his nervous men who watched him with expectant, fearful eyes. He climbed a precarious staircase to what remained of the bell tower, a skeletal structure that offered a panoramic view of their prison. The monastery stood on a slight rise, a lone island in a sea of mud and death. To the west, the church lines were a distant, silent threat. To the east, Vashka's forces were a tightening noose. He saw the glint of artillery pieces being moved into position. Was Rowan right? Was destruction the only way to deny Vashka a total victory? To save the lives of the men who trusted him? He thought of Thomas's frightened face, of Gregor's stolid loyalty. Did they deserve to die for his refusal to bow to a rival? The documents felt heavy in his pocket. Were they worth this? As night fell, a deep unease settled over the monastery. The men were on edge, jumping at every sound. The constant, faint sound of Luca's prayers from the crypt seemed to grate on their nerves. Iskar made a round of the defenses, checking the barricades, speaking a few quiet words to each sentry. He found Thomas at his post overlooking the main entrance, staring out into the darkness towards the church lines. Stay alert, Thomas, Iskar said, placing a hand on his shoulder. The young heretic flinched. Yes, Captain, I was just thinking. About what? Thomas hesitated, then words tumbled out in a rushed confessional whisper. About home, before, all this, about forgiveness. He glanced towards the crypt. He's a man of God, Captain, even now. What if there's still a path back? What if delivering him could be an act of penance? Iskar's grip tightened on Thomas's shoulder. The boy's words confirmed his fear. The prisoner was a poison, seeping into their resolve. There is no path back, Thomas, he said, his voice harder than he meant it to be. The church doesn't offer forgiveness to heretics. They offer the pyre. Your only duty is to the man next to you, to your warband. Remember that. He left Thomas standing there, a conflicted shadow in the moonlight. The dilemma was no longer just tactical, it was spiritual. The siege was breaking them from the inside. Iskar returned to the crypt, his mind no clearer. He stood once more over Brother Luca. The churchman's fever seemed to have broken slightly. His breathing was less ragged, his eyes less clouded. He looked at Iskar with a strange, calm acceptance. Your men are afraid, Luca said, his voice weak but clear. They sense the end. Iskar didn't answer. He simply stared at the man who had become the focal point of his ruin. Burn the documents. Kill the prisoner. It was the logical choice. But as he looked at Luca, at the stubborn faith that death itself could not shake, he knew that logic was a cold comfort in the face of the storm that was coming. He was torn, suspended between pride and survival, with the lives of his men hanging in the balance. The night felt endless, and dawn promised only the beginning of the end. Chapter 4. The siege begins. Dawn did not break so much as it seeped into the sky, a slow gray stain that promised no warmth. The silence that had gripped the monastery was shattered an hour later by the first shrieking whistle of an artillery shell. It was not the deep-throated roar of a heavy howitzer, but the sharper, more spiteful sound of a field gun. Vashka was not trying to pulverize them. She was testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses. The shell exploded 50 yards short of the monastery's eastern wall, showering the stone facade with mud and shrapnel. Iskar, positioned at a slit window in the bell tower, watched the geyser of earth subside. "She's ranging us," he said to Rowan, who stood beside him. "That was a warning shot. The next ones will be on target." "She's in a hurry," Rowan grunted, scanning the trench lines through a battered telescope. No patience for a proper siege. She wants this over with quickly. As if to prove his point, a new sound joined the grim symphony. It was a low, discordant chanting, carried on the wind from Vashka's lines. Choristers, the severed-headed corpses, reborn to sing unholy hymns that clawed at the mind. The sound was not loud, but it was insidious, a vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the skull. It spoke of despair, of futility, of the flesh's inevitable decay. "Damn those things!" One of the heretics below muttered, clutching his helmet as if to block out the noise. "Make it stop." Iskar knew they couldn't stop it. The choristers' song was a weapon as effective as any artillery barrage. It would wear down their nerve, amplify their fear. He saw the effect immediately on his men. Their movements became jerky, their eyes darting towards the source of the sound. The superstitious dread that Brother Luca had inspired was now being weaponized by their own side. "Return fire!" Iskar yelled down to the men manning their lone, scavenged heavy machine gun. "Suppress their forward trenches. Don't let them get comfortable." The gun barked to life, its staccato rhythm a feeble counterpoint to the chorister's drone. It was a gesture of defiance more than an effective tactic. Vashka's forces were too well dug in, but they had to fight back. To do nothing was to surrender. The artillery corrected its aim. The next shell slammed into the monastery's outer wall, blasting a hole the size of a cartwheel through the ancient stone. Rubble cascaded into the courtyard. A second shell followed, then a third. The bombardment was methodical, relentless. Chips of stone and dust filled the air, reducing visibility to a few feet. The heretics hunkered down behind their barricades, their world shrinking to the thunder of impacts and the shaking ground. During a brief lull in the shelling, Iskar heard a scuffle from the direction of the crypt. He pushed through the dust-choked air, his rifle held ready. He found Rowan standing over Thomas, who was sprawled on the stone floor. The heavy oak door to the crypt was ajar. Brother Luca lay on his cot, watching the scene with wide, fearful eyes. "What happened?" Iskar demanded. Rowan's face was a mask of cold fury. "I caught this little rat trying to free the prisoner," he snarled, kicking Thomas lightly in the ribs. "Thought he'd earn himself a ticket back to the church, did you? Deliver their precious observer and beg for absolution?" Thomas looked up, his face bloody where Rowan had struck him. "We're gonna die here," he wept. "I don't want to die damned! He's a holy man! He can save us!" "He can't save anyone, you fool!" Rowan roared, drawing his pistol. "He's the reason we're dying!" "Rowan, no!" Iskar shouted, but he was too late. The shot was deafening in the confined space. Thomas jerked once and then lay still, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The sound seemed to suck all other noise from the world for a moment. Even the artillery outside felt distant. Iskar stared at the body of the young heretic, then at Rowan, who was breathing heavily, his pistol still smoking. Brother Luca had closed his eyes, his lips moving in a final, silent prayer for the boy's soul. "You killed him," Iskar said, his voice hollow. "He was a traitor," Rowan said, holstering his weapon. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. "He would have gotten us all killed. Now we have one less problem." But Iskar knew it was not one less problem. It was a catastrophe. Thomas's death was a crack in the dam. The warband was fracturing. Some men would see Rowan's act as necessary brutality. Others would see the murder of a desperate boy. The fragile unity that had held them together was gone. He could see it in the eyes of the men who had gathered at the sound of the shot, a mixture of shock, fear, and grim acceptance. Some wanted to surrender. Others wanted to fight to the death. And a few, he knew, We're now considering desertion, a near-certain death sentence in no man's land. The shelling began again with renewed intensity. A direct hit on the bell tower sent stonework crashing down into the courtyard. They were being systematically dismantled. Iskar made a desperate decision. "Cease fire," he yelled. "I need a messenger, a flag of truce." A young heretic named Evander, quick and nimble, volunteered. They fashioned a crude white flag from a torn shirt and fixed it to a rifle barrel. "Go to Vashka's lines," Iskar instructed him. "Tell them I wish to parley, propose a meeting, offer to share the intelligence in exchange for safe passage for my men." It was a gamble, a confession of weakness, but it was the only move he had left. An hour passed. The shelling stopped, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the moaning of the wounded and the ever-present choristers. Then Evander returned, scrambling over the rubble. "She agreed, Captain. A temporary ceasefire. She'll meet you at the halfway point between our lines. Neutral ground." Iskar nodded, his throat dry. He checked his pistol, ensuring it was loaded. Rowan grabbed his arm. "Don't do this, Iskar. It's a trap." "Everything is a trap, Rowan," Iskar replied, pulling his arm free. "This is the only trap that might have an exit." He climbed over the broken monastery wall and walked out into no man's land. The mud clung to his boots, and the eyes of the dead seemed to watch him from 1,000 shallow graves. Ahead, a similar party emerged from Vashka's trenches. Overseer Vashka herself, clad in immaculate black armor adorned with polished brass, stood flanked by Kale and a squad of silent death commandos. They met in the shadow of a burnt-out tank, its hull a monument to a forgotten battle. "Captain Iskar," Vashka said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth, "you see the futility of your position. Surrender the documents and the prisoner, and I may be lenient." "I propose a partnership, Overseer," Iskar said, forcing a calm he did not feel. "The intelligence is significant. I will share it with you. In return, you grant my warband safe passage out of this sector. We disappear. You get the credit." Vashka's lips curved into a thin smile. "You are in no position to propose terms, Captain. I will have what I want. The only question is how many of your men I have to kill to get it. This is not a negotiation. It is an unconditional surrender." Iskar's hope, what little remained, evaporated. "Then there is nothing to discuss. We will fight." "Fight?" Vashka laughed, a short, harsh sound. "You call that pathetic resistance a fight? You are an insect, Iskar, and I have already taken steps to ensure you are crushed." She leaned forward slightly. "I have sent word to High Command that you are a traitor, hoarding vital intelligence for your own gain. Even if you somehow slip my net, you will be hunted down. There is no escape for you, none." The ceasefire was over before it had truly begun. Vashka turned on her heel and strode back to her lines, her death commandos forming a protective screen around her. Kale lingered for a moment, his expression unreadable behind his helmet, then followed. Iskar stood alone in the mud, the weight of Vashka's words pressing down on him. She had not only besieged him physically, she had damned him politically. There was no way out. He was a dead man walking, and he had led his men into the grave with him. He turned and trudged back to the monastery. As he reached the shattered wall, the first shells of the renewed bombardment began to fall. This time, there was no hesitation. Vashka's artillery found its range, and the world dissolved into fire, noise, and flying stone. The siege was no longer a threat, it was an execution. Chapter 5: The Prisoner's Confession. The monastery was dying around them. Each artillery impact was a hammer blow against a dying beast, shaking loose great chunks of masonry and filling the air with a thick, blinding dust. Iskar's world had narrowed to the next explosion, the next rattle of machine gun fire as Vashka's infantry began their advance under the cover of the barrage. The outer walls were gone, reduced to a low pile of rubble that offered scant protection. His men fought with the desperate fury of the condemned, but they were being pushed back, foot by bloody foot, into the heart of the ruin. Through the chaos, a figure stumbled towards him. Gregor, his face a mask of soot and blood. "Captain, the crypt, the churchman, he's awake, and he's asking for you." Iskar almost dismissed it. What did a dying man's request matter now? But something in Gregor's tone, a flicker of something other than panic, gave him pause. Perhaps it was a final act of defiance, a last chance to spit in the eye of the enemy before the end. He nodded, shouting to Rowan to hold the line, and ducked into the relative quiet of the stone staircase leading down. The crypt was an oasis of eerie calm. The thick walls muffled the thunder of the bombardment to a dull rumble like a far-off storm. Brother Luca lay on his cot, propped up against the wall. The feverish glaze was gone from his eyes, replaced by a startling clarity. He looked weak, his skin stretched taut over his bones, but he was present. He watched Iskar approach with a calm, almost pitying gaze. "Captain," Luca said, his voice a dry whisper, yet firm, "your fortress falls." "It was never much of a fortress," Iskar replied, his own voice rough with dust and fatigue. He leaned his rifle against the wall. "You asked for me. If this is about last rites, you've chosen the wrong man." A faint smile touched Luca's lips. "No, it is about the truth, a confession before God and before you." He took a shallow, rattling breath. "The documents you captured, the maps, the supply routes." Iskar's hand went instinctively to his coat pocket. "What about them?" "They are worthless." The words hung in the damp air, simple and devastating. Iskar stared at him, certain he had misheard. "What?" "They are decoys," Luca continued, his eyes holding Iskar's. "Outdated routes that the church abandoned months ago. My mission was not observation, it was deception. To plant false intelligence, to draw out heretic infiltrators, to make your commanders waste their strength on phantom targets." Iskar felt the ground lurch beneath him, not from an explosion, but from the sheer force of the revelation. He stumbled back a step, his mind reeling. "You're lying, to save yourself." "I am dying, Captain," Luca said calmly. "I have no reason to lie. My capture was an unforeseen complication, but the mission's purpose remains. You see, your greed, your pride in capturing this prize, it has led you into a trap of your own making. And Overseer Vashka's ambition has turned a minor skirmish into a slaughter over nothing." The truth crashed down on Iskar with the weight of a collapsing mountain. The deaths of Lycos and Silas in the wire, the betrayal and killing of Thomas, the siege, the certain death of his entire warband. All of it, for nothing. A handful of papers that were less than worthless, they were a poison. He saw the entire tragic chain of events laid bare, a monument to his own foolishness. He had been so consumed with striking a blow against the church, with defying Vashka, that he had never stopped to question the bait. "A trap," Iskar whispered, the fury rising in him now, hot and bitter. He advanced on the cot. You knew all along, and you said nothing. You let my men die for your damned deception." Luca did not flinch. "I am a soldier of the church, Captain. My duty is to my faith and my command. Your suffering is a regrettable consequence of a holy war. I will not apologize for doing my duty any more than you would apologize for doing yours." The calm acceptance in the man's voice was more galling than any insult. Iskar wanted to strike him, to throttle the life from him with his bare hands. But as he looked into Luca's eyes, he saw not malice, but a profound, unshakable conviction. This was not a personal cruelty. It was the cold, impersonal machinery of war. Both he and Vashka had been outmaneuvered by a system they thought they understood. They were not commanders. They were pawns on a board they couldn't even see. The rage drained from Iskar, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. He sank onto a nearby crate, his head in his hands. The sounds of the battle above seemed to fade away. He had risked everything, and it had all been a mirage. The church had not just beaten him, they had made him a fool. "Why tell me this now?" he asked, his voice flat. "Why give your enemy the satisfaction of knowing he's been played?" Luca's breathing was becoming more labored. "Because even an enemy deserves to know the truth before he dies, and because there may yet be a way to spare your men further bloodshed." He paused, gathering his strength. "Surrender the documents to Vashka. Confess the truth. Expose the church's deception. It will not save you, but it may rob her of her victory. It may show your men that they are not dying for a cause, but for the vanity of two rival officers. It may grant them a measure of peace." Iskar looked up. The idea was absurd. Walking into Vashka's camp with a confession of his own gullibility, it would be a final humiliation. Yet, as he thought of Roan, of Gregor, of the few men who were still fighting and dying upstairs for a lie, he saw a grim logic in it. If they were to die, let them die knowing the truth. Let Vashka's triumph be tainted by the knowledge that she had been fighting a shadow. The revelation had shaken him to his core. It was not just a tactical defeat, it was a philosophical one. His entire rebellion, his hatred, his identity as a heretic, it had all been based on the premise that he was fighting a tangible, corrupt enemy. But now he saw that the real enemy was the endless, cyclical nature of the conflict itself, a machine that consumed everything. Faith and rebellion alike, with impartial hunger. He stood up, the documents feeling like a lead weight in his pocket. He looked at Luca, who had closed his eyes again, his confession given, his strength spent. Peace, Iskar repeated the word, tasting its bitterness. There would be no peace. But there could, perhaps, be a sliver of understanding in the final, blinding light. He turned and walked back up the stairs towards the thunder and the dying, his path clear for the first time since the fallen star had crashed into his life. It was a path to ruin, but it was the only one left. Chapter 6, The Betrayal. The inner sanctum of the monastery was the last redoubt, a circular chamber that had once housed sacred relics. Now it held only the desperate and the dying. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid tang of spent gunpowder. Iskar's warband, what was left of it, was a ragged circle of exhaustion behind a final barricade of broken pews and sandbags. The outer defenses had fallen. Vashka's forces controlled the courtyard, the halls, and were now pounding at the sanctum's heavy oak doors. Iskar moved among his men, his own body a tapestry of fresh wounds and burning fatigue. The revelation from the crypt echoed in his mind, a silent scream beneath the cacophony of battle. Worthless, a decoy. The words were a poison that had seeped into his soul. But Brother Luca's final advice offered a twisted kind of clarity. He found Rowan crouched behind the barricade, methodically firing through a crack in the door. "Rowan," Iskar yelled over the din. "I need another messenger, a flag of truce." Rowan stared at him as if he'd gone mad. "Have you lost your senses? They'll shoot him before he takes 10 steps. "Tell them I have new information," Iskar insisted, his voice raw. "Critical intelligence about the documents. Tell her I'll reveal everything. Just stop the attack." He saw the doubt in Rowan's eyes, the suspicion that the strain had finally broken his captain. But the sergeant's loyalty, forged in countless battles, held firm. He nodded curtly and bellowed for Evander. The young heretic, his arm now bandaged from a shrapnel wound, scrambled over. Iskar gave him the same instructions, adding, "Tell her I know the truth about the church's deception. It changes everything." The firing from outside slackened as the white flag was seen. An eerie quiet descended, broken only by the moans of the wounded. The pounding on the door ceased. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then a voice called from the other side. "Overseer Vashka agrees. She will meet. Come out, Iskar, alone." Iskar checked his pistol. It was a futile gesture, but a necessary one. He looked at Rowan, at the grim, bloodied faces of his men. "Hold this position," he ordered, though the command felt hollow. They all knew what holding meant now. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the main hall of the monastery. It was a vision of hell. The once grand space was a charnel house, littered with bodies and rubble. Vashka's troops stood in a wide semicircle, their weapons trained on him. In the center stood Overseer Vashka, flanked by Kale and a full squad of death commandos, their black armor gleaming in the dust-choked light filtering through the holes in the ceiling. "Well, Captain?" Vashka's voice cut through the silence. "This is an unexpected surrender. Have you finally come to your senses?" "It's not a surrender," Iskar said, walking forward until he was a dozen paces from her. He held up the oilskin packet. "It's a warning, for both of us." He took a deep breath. "The documents are forgeries, church counterintelligence. The roots are decoys abandoned months ago. Brother Luca confessed it to me before he died. We've been fighting over nothing. The church manipulated us into destroying each other." He laid it all out, calmly, clearly, presenting the facts as Luca had given them to him. He watched Vashka's face, expecting to see dawning realization, perhaps even a flicker of the same cold horror he had felt. Instead, her expression hardened into a mask of contemptuous disbelief. "A clever story, Iskar," she sneered. "Truly, to think I almost credited you with more intelligence. You think you can avoid punishment by concocting a fable about church trickery?" She took a step forward, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. "I am not a fool. You are trying to rob me of my victory with a desperate lie." It's the truth, Iskar insisted, his calm fracturing. Kale, you're a pragmatist. You know the church's methods. This is plausible. Verify it. Don't throw your men's lives away on a mistake. Kale, who had been standing silently, shifted his weight. His helmeted head turned slightly towards Vashka. Overseer, the captain's story, while unsubstantiated, is not without precedent. The Synod has used such tactics before. It would be prudent to verify the intelligence before. Enough, Vashka snapped, cutting him off. Her eyes blazed with a fury that was personal, not tactical. Her ambition, her pride, was the only truth she would accept. I will not have my triumph questioned by a traitor and his excuses. Death commandos, execute him! The circle of black-armored soldiers raised their weapons. Iskar's hand went to his pistol, a final, futile gesture of defiance. In that frozen second, he saw Rowan and his men, watching from the shattered doorway of the sanctum. He saw the look on Rowan's face, not fear, but a cold, determined rage. They had heard everything. Rowan did not shout a command. He simply raised his rifle and fired. The shot rang out, striking the death commando nearest to Vashka in the shoulder. It was the spark that lit the powder keg. The hall erupted into chaos. Iskar's warband, seeing their captain about to be executed, opened fire from the sanctum doorway. Vashka's troops, caught by surprise, returned fire indiscriminately. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the screams of the hit. Iskar dove for cover behind a collapsed pillar as bullets whined off the stone around him. He saw Kale, instead of firing at him, shove Vashka backwards, shouting, "Take cover!" In the confusion, a stray shot caught Iskar in the side, a hot, piercing pain that drove the air from his lungs. He stumbled, clutching the wound. Through a haze of pain and gunsmoke, he saw Kale firing his own weapon, not at the sanctum, but at the feet of Vashka's troops, creating a momentary barrier of confusion. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Kale gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod towards the sanctum. Then he turned and began barking orders, deliberately adding to the disarray. It was not help, but it was an opportunity. Gritting his teeth against the fire in his side, Iskar scrambled on his hands and knees through the carnage. Rowan lunged from the doorway, grabbing him by the collar and hauling him back into the relative safety of the sanctum as bullets peppered the doorframe. "You fool," Rowan roared, dragging him behind the barricade. "Trying to reason with that harpy. I told you it was a trap." "I had to try," Iskar gasped, blood seeping through his fingers. The wound was bad. He could feel the strength leaching from his body. Outside, the chaotic firefight was settling into a more organized assault. Vashka's voice could be heard screaming orders, restoring discipline. The moment of confusion was over. The temporary ceasefire had become a bloody prelude to the final act. Rowan propped Iskar against the wall and turned to the handful of surviving heretics. Their faces were pale, streaked with grime and blood, but their eyes held a grim resolve. They had seen their captain shot down under a flag of truce. There would be no more talk of surrender. "You heard the bitch," Rowan yelled, his voice raw with fury. "She wants no witnesses. She wants us all dead. Well, we're not going quietly. Every shot, every second. Make her pay for this." The men roared their approval, a desperate, defiant sound. They checked their weapons, shoved fresh clips into rifles, and prepared for the final storm. Iskar, leaning against the cold stone, looked at Rowan. The sergeant's intervention had saved his life, but it had also sealed their fate. There would be no negotiation now, only a last bloody stand. Kale's unexpected aid bought them minutes, not hours. But in the economy of a siege, minutes were a fortune. Iskar closed his eyes, the pain in his side a dull, throbbing counterpoint to the crashing of the axes against the sanctum door. The betrayal was complete. Vashka had chosen her pride over the truth, and in doing so had guaranteed the destruction of them all. The documents, the prisoner, the truth, none of it mattered anymore. Only the fight remained. Chapter 7. The Last Stand. The heavy oak doors of the sanctum splintered under the combined force of a ramming charge and concentrated rifle fire. With a final groaning crack, they burst inward, and the storm broke upon them. Vashka's troops poured into the chamber, a tide of gray uniforms and bayonets, their faces set in grim determination. They were met by the last, desperate fury of Iskar's warband. Iskar leaned against the cold stone wall, his vision blurring at the edges. The wound in his side was a furnace of pain, each breath a fresh agony. He could no longer stand, let alone fight. He watched the scene unfold as if from a great distance, the sounds of battle muffled and distorted. He saw Roan, a demon unleashed, wielding a trench shovel like a battle axe, roaring curses as he broke the charge of two soldiers. He saw Gregor, his massive frame a bulwark, firing his heavy machine gun until it jammed, then using the red-hot barrel as a club. "Rowan!" Iskar's voice was a weak rasp, lost in the din. "Take command! Hold the line!" Rowan glanced back at him, his face a mask of blood and fury. He gave a curt nod and turned back to the fray, bellowing orders, organizing the shrinking circle of defenders. They fought with the strength of men who had nothing left to lose. Barricades were pushed forward, abandoned, and retaken in a brutal dance of advance and retreat. The sanctum floor grew slick with blood. In the center of the chaos, ignored by the combatants, lay Brother Luca on his cot. He was too weak to move, his life bleeding out from the fever and his untreated wounds. As the fighting raged around him, he began to pray aloud, his voice a thin, clear thread amidst the roaring chaos. He did not pray for deliverance, but for the souls of the men who were dying. To Iskar's astonishment, he saw several of his heretics falter. A man named Evander, who had carried the messages of truce, stumbled away from the barricade, his rifle clattering to the floor. He fell to his knees beside Luca's cot, his shoulders shaking with sobs. Another man, then a third, joined him. Exhausted, terrified, and facing certain death, they sought solace in the very faith they had rebelled against. They clasped their hands and joined the prayer, their voices a ragged chorus beneath the churchman's steady chant. Iskar watched, a bitter irony twisting in his gut. These men, who had turned their backs on God, were now finding their only comfort in his presence as they marched to meet him. Their rebellion had led them here, to a dusty crypt, to die on their knees beside a priest of the enemy. He wondered if he had been wrong all along. Had his hatred blinded him to something essential? Had the path of the heretic been just another road to the same damned end? The tide of battle could not be held back by prayer. Vashka's forces, disciplined and numerous, regrouped and pressed their advantage. A grenade exploded near the barricade, silencing the machine gun and killing Gregor instantly. The line broke. Soldiers flooded into the sanctum, engaging in brutal, close-quarters combat. Rowan fought like a man possessed, but he was overwhelmed. A bayonet took him in the thigh. As he fell, another soldier lunged forward. Rowan looked up, his eyes meeting Iskar's across the room, and died with a final defiant curse on his lips. The end came quickly after that. The remaining heretics were cut down where they stood, or against the wall where they knelt. Soon, the only sounds were the moans of the wounded and the harsh breathing of the victors. Through the haze of pain, Iskar saw Kale step through the carnage. The Death Commando's black armor was spattered with blood, but he moved with the same unnerving grace. He stopped beside Iskar. "I delayed her reinforcements," Kale said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Falsified the readiness reports. Bought you a few hours. It wasn't enough." He looked around the room, at the bodies of Iskar's men, at the praying heretics who had been summarily executed. "She'll claim a great victory, but some of us will know the truth." Before Iskar could respond, a path cleared through the soldiers. Overseer Vashka walked into the sanctum, her boots stepping delicately over the dead. Her face was a mask of cold triumph. She surveyed the scene, the bodies, the defeated captain, the dying priest, and her smile was thin and sharp. She ignored Kale and walked directly to where Iskar sat slumped against the wall. Her eyes fell on the small fire Iskar had kindled earlier for warmth. In it, the edges of the oilskin packet were blackening and curling, the papers within turning to ash. "What have you done?" Vashka's voice was dangerously quiet. Iskar looked from the burning documents to Brother Luca, who lay still, his prayers finished, his breath a faint whisper. Then he looked back at Vashka, and a strange sense of peace settled over him. The fight was over. The lies were burned away. "I've set us free," Iskar said calmly, "from your ambition, from the church's deception, from the worthless prize we killed each other for." Vashka's composure shattered, her face contorted with rage. She drew her pistol, leveling it at Iskar's head. "You miserable traitor! You robbed me of my victory even in death!" Brother Luca, with his last breath, spoke. His voice was a faint exhalation, but every word was clear. He speaks the truth. The documents were false. Forgive him, Captain. Seek redemption. The words hung in the smoke-filled air. Then Luca's head lolled to the side, his eyes staring sightlessly at the vaulted ceiling. His final act had been one of absolution. The pistol in Vashka's hand did not waver. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Iskar closed his eyes. Ready. The reckoning had come. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The silence after Luca's final words was more profound than any explosion. It was broken by the sharp, metallic click of the pistol's hammer being pulled back. Iskar kept his eyes closed, waiting for the shot that would end it. He felt no fear, only a weary acceptance. Luca's forgiveness, offered so freely to his captor and enemy, had granted him a strange absolution. The fight was over. The truth was known. Overseer. Kale's voice cut through the tension, calm and deliberate. Hold. Vashka's rage was a palpable heat in the room. Do not interfere, Commando. His execution is my right. Is it? Kale took a step forward, his hands open, but his posture remained that of a predator. Think. You execute him now, on his knees, after he has burned the documents and his pet priest has confirmed his story. What does that look like to High Command? It looks like you silencing a witness. It looks like you covering up a catastrophic error in judgment. Vashka's aim did not falter, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Kale pressed his advantage, his voice dropping, becoming conspiratorial. You present him to the interrogators, a broken man, full of a wild story about church deception. If he's lying, they will tear the truth from him, and your victory is secure. But if, by some chance, he is telling the truth. Kale gestured to the ashes of the documents. Then you have exposed a major church intelligence operation. You have captured the officer who uncovered it. You look like a strategist, not a butcher. You hand the problem to High Command and let them share in the embarrassment if it proves true. Killing him here is an emotional reaction. Taking him prisoner is a calculated move. Iskar listened, his mind clear despite the pain. Kale was not defending him. He was playing the long game. Undermining Vashka, creating a narrative that could topple her. He was a pragmatist, and he saw more value in a living, talking prisoner than a dead martyr. Vashka hesitated, torn between her consuming pride and her sharp political instincts. The pistol wavered. Her eyes darted from Iskar's peaceful face to Kale's calculating gaze, to the faces of her own soldiers, who watched the scene with a mixture of unease and anticipation. To kill him now would be satisfying, a final assertion of her power. But it would be messy. It would raise questions. With a sudden, sharp motion, she lowered the pistol. Take him, she snarled at her soldiers, her voice thick with suppressed fury. Chain him. He will answer to the interrogators, and when they prove him a liar, I will personally oversee his execution. 2 soldiers grabbed Iskar under the arms, hauling him to his feet. A wave of dizziness and pain washed over him as his wounded side was jostled. He did not resist as heavy manacles were clamped around his wrists. He was dragged past the body of Brother Luca, past the corpses of Rowan and Gregor and Thomas and all the men who had followed him. As he was pulled from the sanctum, he caught one last look at Kale. The Death Commando stood watching, his helmeted head tilted in what might have been contemplation. Their eyes met for a final moment, and Iskar understood. This was not salvation. It was a postponement. A transfer of his fate from the battlefield to the interrogation chambers, where a different kind of death awaited. But it was a death that would carry the truth with it. Vashka's victory would forever be tainted by the question he represented. He was dragged through the ruined monastery, through the courtyard littered with the dead of both sides. The scale of the slaughter for a handful of ashes was staggering. He was thrown into the back of an armored transport, the doors slamming shut, plunging him into darkness. The vehicle rumbled to life, carrying him away from the only home he had known for years. The journey was a blur of pain and exhaustion. He faded in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with the faces of the fallen, the defiant Rowan, the frightened Thomas, the resolute Luca. When the doors finally opened, the gray light of late afternoon stung his eyes. He was in the heart of Vashka's bunker complex, a labyrinth of concrete and steel. He was hauled down sterile corridors, past cells filled with the moans of other prisoners, and thrown into a cold, windowless room. The manacles were chained to a ring in the floor. The soldiers left without a word. He was alone. Hours passed, or perhaps days. He lost track of time. His wound was roughly bandaged, but it still burned. They brought him water and a thin gruel, enough to keep him alive. He expected the interrogators at any moment, with their needles and their questions, but they did not come. Eventually, the door opened again. It was not an interrogator, but Kale. The death commando entered alone, carrying a small stool. He placed it opposite Iskar and sat down, removing his helmet. His sharp, handsome face was unreadable. "Vashka is composing her report," Kale said, his voice echoing softly in the bare cell. "She will claim a great victory, the capture of vital intelligence and the destruction of a treacherous warband. Your name will be listed as a prize, to be interrogated at the leisure of high command." Iskar said nothing. He simply watched. "The story you told," Kale continued, leaning forward, "about the documents, is it true?" "Yes." Kale studied him for a long time, as if weighing the soul behind the word. Finally, he nodded, almost to himself. "I believe you." He stood up. "It changes nothing, and it changes everything. The war will go on. Vashka will probably be promoted, but the seed of doubt is planted. For some of us, that is enough." He walked to the door, then paused, looking back at Iskar. "The real enemy is not the church, Captain Iskar, and it is not us, it is this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the cell, the bunker, the entire war, the cycle, the ambition, the betrayal, the suffering that feeds on itself. We are all just fuel for the machine. With that, he left, the door locking behind him with a final heavy thud. Iskar was alone again with his thoughts. He thought of Luca's final words, offering forgiveness. He thought of Rowan's last, defiant curse. He thought of the young, hopeful face Tomas had once worn. They were all gone, but he was here, broken, a prisoner, yet strangely unbroken in spirit. The truth had set him free, as Luca had said it would. Not free from his chains, but from the lies that had chained him for so long. His hatred for the church remained, but it was no longer the core of his being. It was a fact, like the wound in his side or the cold of the floor. He did not know what the interrogators would do to him. He did not know if Vashka would succeed in burying the truth. But as he sat in the darkness, he found a measure of peace. He had fought, he had lost, but he had understood the game at the end. In the grand, bloody tragedy of the Trench Crusade, that was perhaps the only victory any soldier could ever hope to achieve. The machine would grind on, but he was no longer one of its gears. He was just a man, waiting in the dark, finally at peace with the silence. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with friends and consider a small donation to help cover production costs. Links are in the description.